The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Bagram Airfield like a blade through silk. Mayday, Mayday, this is Reaper 6. We are compromised, heavily outnumbered, and taking effective fire from three sides. Immediate close air support required, over. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Sledgehammer Rodriguez froze mid-coffee sip in the Tactical Operations Center, the steam from his mug suddenly seeming trivial against the urgency bleeding through the static. The voice belonged to Navy SEAL Team 6's ground commander, a man Rodriguez had never heard sound anything less than absolutely confident. Now there was something different, not panic, but the controlled desperation of a professional acknowledging the mathematics of death. Reaper 6, this is Overlord. Confirm your grid coordinates and nature of contact. The air traffic controller responded, fingers already dancing across his keyboard, pulling up satellite imagery of the Hindu Kush Mountains where shadows still clung to rocky outcroppings like secrets. Grid 41 SPR 23,456 78,901. We've got approximately 40 Taliban fighters in prepared positions. RPGs, heavy machine guns, the works. They knew we were coming. The transmission broke apart briefly, punctuated by the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire and something heavier, possibly a Soviet-era PKM. We've got 2 wounded, minimal ammunition, and they're closing the noose. We need someone who can thread the needle here, Overlord. These mountains don't forgive mistakes. Rodriguez set down his coffee and moved toward the mission board, his eyes scanning the available aircraft. Most of the base's close air support assets were committed to operations further south, leaving precious few options. His gaze stopped on a single name written in neat block letters: Captain Kestrel Wraith Thorn, A-10C Thunderbolt II. The other pilots called her the Ghost, not entirely as a compliment. She'd earned her call sign Wraith after a mission in Syria where she'd emerged from a sandstorm like something supernatural, her twin-engine Warthog appearing so suddenly that ground forces initially mistook her for enemy aircraft. But there were whispers too, the kind that followed female pilots in a brotherhood that still wasn't entirely sure what to do with them. Some said she was too cautious, too precise, that she lacked the killer instinct necessary for close air support missions, where split-second decisions separated Allied forces from friendly fire incidents. Rodriguez had read her file, though. Graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy, distinguished herself in 3 combat deployments, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to place ordnance exactly where it needed to go. The problem wasn't her capability, it was perception. In a world where reputation often mattered more than reality, Kestrel Thorn remained perpetually in the shadows, always competent but never celebrated. Now, with American lives hanging in the balance and dawn still hours away, she might be their only hope. The mountains of Afghanistan had claimed too many good people already. Today, Rodriguez hoped, would be different. But first, someone had to wake the Wraith and ask her to dance with death one more time in a theater where the smallest mistake echoed forever through valleys carved by ancient glaciers and modern warfare. The clock on the Tactical Operations Center wall showed 3:48 hours. Somewhere in the darkness, 8 Navy SEALs were counting down the minutes until dawn and wondering if they'd live to see it. Captain Kestrel Thorn jolted awake at the first buzz of her encrypted phone muscle memory from countless combat deployments, translating the sound into immediate alertness. No grogginess, no confusion, just the instant transition from sleep to operational readiness that separated combat veterans from everyone else. Her small quarters at Bagram were Spartan even by military standards. A narrow cot, a metal locker, and a small desk where her flight helmet sat like a talisman, its dark visor reflecting the amber glow of the base's security, lights filtering through her single window. Wraith, this is Overlord. We need you airborne in 15 minutes. Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of urgency without the luxury of elaboration. SEAL team is pinned down in the mountains. Heavy contact, multiple wounded, and you're the only asset available." Kestrel swung her legs over the side of the cot, feet finding her flight boots with practiced precision. "Copy, Overlord. Grid coordinates and threat assessment." As Rodriguez rattled off the tactical situation, Kestrel was already moving, pulling on her flight suit with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd done this dance hundreds of times before. But even as her hands worked automatically, zipping, buckling, securing, her mind was calculating angles, distances, and probabilities. The Hindu Kush in pre-dawn darkness was unforgiving terrain even under ideal circumstances. Add hostile forces with prepared positions and American lives in the balance, and the margin for error shrank to nothing. "Wraith, be advised," Rodriguez continued, and something in his tone made her pause while reaching for her helmet. "The weather report shows heavy cloud cover moving in from the west. Visibility is going to be compromised, and these mountains don't give you room for second chances." "Understood, Overlord." Kestrel grabbed her mission bag and headed for the door, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, her ground crew was already prepping her A-10. The Thunderbolt II wasn't the fastest aircraft in the Air Force inventory, or the most sophisticated, but it was built for exactly this kind of mission, close air support in hostile territory where precision mattered more than speed. "I'll have ordnance on target in 37 minutes. The flight line was alive with controlled urgency as Kestrel approached her aircraft. Crew Chief Technical Sergeant Maria Vasquez looked up from the final weapons check, her weathered face creased with concern. "Ma'am, we've loaded her with a mixed bag GAU-8 with high-explosive incendiary rounds, 2 AGM-65 Mavericks, and a full complement of 2.75-inch rockets. Should give you options for whatever you find up there." Kestrel nodded, running her hands along the aircraft's titanium armor plating in what had become her pre-flight ritual. The A-10 was an ugly aircraft by conventional standards, a flying gun built around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed its heart. But to her, it was beautiful in its purpose, every rivet and plate designed for one mission, bringing American servicemen home alive. "Weather's turning bad, Captain," Sergeant Vasquez said quietly, glancing toward the mountains where storm clouds were gathering like dark omens. "Maybe wait for better conditions." Kestrel secured her helmet and began her walk-around inspection, checking control surfaces and ordnance mounting points. "8 men don't have time for better conditions, Sergeant. Besides," she allowed herself a rare smile, "ghosts fly best in bad weather." As she climbed into the cockpit, Kestrel could hear the radio chatter from the Tactical Operations Center bleeding through her headset. The SEALs were still alive, but their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Dawn would bring clear fields of fire for the Taliban forces, eliminating what little tactical advantage the Americans still possessed. She fired up the twin General Electric TF-34 engines, feeling their familiar vibration through the aircraft's frame like a mechanical heartbeat. In the distance, storm clouds were building, and somewhere beyond them, 8 men were fighting for their lives in terrain that had swallowed armies for thousands of years. The pre-dawn darkness seemed to swallow Captain Kestrel Thorne's A-10 as it lifted off from Bagram's runway, twin engines carving a path through air thick with the promise of approaching storms. At 8,000 feet, she leveled off and checked her navigation display, the green glow illuminating her focused expression behind the helmet's visor. The flight to the target area would take 23 minutes during which the tactical situation on the ground could change dramatically. "Reaper 6, this is Wraith inbound from Bagram. ETA to your position 20 minutes. Can you mark your position and provide an update on enemy locations?" Her voice carried the calm professionalism that came from years of flying combat missions, but underneath was something else, a determination that had been forged in the crucible of previous deployments where she'd proven herself repeatedly, even if recognition had been slow to follow. The response came through heavy static, punctuated by automatic weapons fire. "Wraith, Reaper 6, We're in a horseshoe-shaped valley, approximately 500 meters east of Grid 41 SPR 23,456, 78,901. Enemy forces have us surrounded on three sides with prepared positions in the rocks above us. We've got two urgent surgical cases and ammunition is running low. Weather's deteriorating rapidly, visibility dropping fast. Kestrel absorbed the information while monitoring her instruments, noting the steadily dropping barometric pressure and the wall of clouds approaching from the west. In the Tactical Operations Center, she knew Rodriguez and his team were watching her progress on their tracking displays, probably wondering if the quiet pilot who'd never quite fit the fighter-jock stereotype could handle what was shaping up to be one of the most challenging close air support missions of the deployment. She'd heard the whispers, of course, in the ready room in the dining facility, in the informal conversations that shaped reputations in the military. Thorne's technically proficient, but does she have the killer instinct? She's cautious to a fault. Sometimes you need someone who will take risks. Good pilot, but in a real knife fight, you want someone with more aggression. What they didn't understand was that her precision wasn't caution, it was confidence. Every careful approach, every methodical target analysis, every patient wait for the perfect firing solution was born from absolute certainty in her abilities and deep respect for the responsibility she carried. When you were dropping ordnance danger close to friendly forces, precision wasn't optional. It was the difference between bringing people home and living with nightmares for the rest of your life. Wraith, be advised we're starting to lose visual on enemy positions due to weather, Reaper 6 transmitted, strain evident in his voice despite professional composure. Storm front is moving in faster than forecast. We may need you to work off coordinates only. Kestrel checked her multifunction displays, nodding the weather radar painting an ominous picture ahead. The storm system was massive, stretching across the Hindu Kush like a gray blanket that would reduce visibility to near zero. Flying close air support missions in those conditions would push both her skills and her aircraft to their limits. Copy, Reaper 6. I'll work with what you can give me. She adjusted her flight path slightly, climbing to 10,000 feet to stay above the worst of the turbulence while still maintaining the ability to dive quickly into attack position. Stand by for on-station time in 15 minutes. As the first wisps of cloud began to streak past her canopy, Captain Kestrel Thorne did what she'd always done when facing impossible odds. She got to work. The mathematics of the mission were stark: 8 American lives against 40 Taliban fighters in prepared positions, complicated by deteriorating weather and terrain that offered no margin for error. In the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez watched her progress on the tracking display and found himself holding his breath. The Wraith was about to earn her call sign all over again. The storm hit Captain Kestrel Thorne's A-10 like a living thing, turbulence slamming the aircraft with invisible fists that tested every rivet in its armored frame. At 12,000 feet, she was flying blind through clouds so dense they seemed solid, relying entirely on instruments while ice began forming on her wing leading edges. The GPS coordinates for Reaper 6's position glowed steadily on her navigation display. But coordinates were just numbers until she could translate them into the visual reality of mountainous terrain where 8 men were fighting for their lives. Reaper 6, Wraith is on station but visibility is 0-0. I need you to pop smoke or use your infrared strobe so I can get a visual reference. Her voice remained steady despite the aircraft's violent motion, years of instrument flying in combat conditions serving her well, as she fought to maintain controlled flight in conditions that would challenge any pilot. The response was immediate but strained. Wraith, we're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Popping smoke now, but be advised the wind is gusting and it's going to disperse rapidly. We've lost visual on most enemy positions due to weather. Kestrel dropped altitude, descending through the cloud layer with careful precision, her eyes scanning the instrument panel for any sign of terrain proximity warnings. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose to over 15,000 feet in some areas, and flying low in zero visibility was essentially a controlled exercise in barely avoiding suicide. At 8,000 feet, she began to see breaks in the clouds, brief glimpses of rocky terrain that looked alien and hostile in the gray pre-dawn light. Then she saw it, a thin tendril of red smoke drifting from a cluster of boulders near what appeared to be a frozen streambed. The smoke was already dissipating in the wind, but it gave her the reference point she needed. More importantly, it confirmed that Reaper 6 was still alive and fighting. Smoke spotted, Reaper 6. I have your position. Now I need you to walk me onto the bad guys. Kestrel banked left, beginning a wide circle around the valley while her eyes searched for muzzle flashes or any other indication of enemy positions. The tactical problem was becoming clear now. The SEALs were pinned in low ground while Taliban fighters occupied superior positions in the rocks above them. Classic military terrain advantage that was proving devastatingly effective. Wraith, primary threat, is a heavy machine gun position approximately 300 meters northeast of our smoke, elevation about 200 feet above us. They've got us completely pinned down. The voice belonged to Reaper 6's team leader, and even through the static and stress, Kestrel could hear the controlled desperation of a professional soldier who understood that his options were rapidly disappearing. Kestrel spotted the position, a natural rock formation that provided excellent cover and commanding fields of fire. Flashes of light were visible even through the storm, confirming active hostile fire. But the target was danger close to the SEAL team's position, requiring precision that would challenge even her considerable skills in ideal conditions. In this weather, with limited visibility and unstable air, it would require everything she had. Reaper 6, I have eyes on the target. Danger close engagement. Confirm you and all personnel are in hard cover. All personnel in cover, Wraith. You are cleared hot. Captain Kestrel Thorne rolled her A-10 into a 30-degree dive, the twin engines spooling up as she aligned the aircraft's nose with the target coordinates burned into her memory. Through her heads-up display, the targeting reticle settled over the machine gun position like a promise. Her finger found the trigger for the A-10 cannon, 30 millimeters of precision-guided death that had been designed specifically for moments like this. The storm continued to rage around her, but in the cockpit of her Thunderbolt, Kestrel had found the calm that always came when everything depended on her ability to place ordnance exactly where it needed to go. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd lived for through 3 combat deployments and countless hours of preparation. 8 men were counting on her. She wouldn't let them down. The A-10 Avenger cannon spoke with a voice like thunder, its distinctive brrrrt sound echoing across the Hindu Kush Mountains as Captain Kestrel Thorne's A-10 dove through the storm clouds like an avenging angel. Depleted uranium rounds tore into the Taliban machine gun position with surgical precision, each projectile finding its mark, despite the challenging weather conditions and limited visibility. The hostile fire that had been pouring down onto the SEAL team's position suddenly went silent. Good hit, Reaper 6's voice crackled through the radio with barely contained relief. Primary target destroyed, but we've got movement on the western ridge. Looks like they're trying to flank us. Kestrel pulled out of her attack dive, climbing back into the safety of altitude while her eyes searched the terrain below for the new threat. The western ridge was a jagged spine of rock that offered numerous positions for enemy fighters, and the approaching dawn was beginning to provide just enough light to reveal the scope of the tactical problem. The SEALs weren't just outnumbered. They were positioned in a natural kill zone with limited options for movement or escape. I see them, Reaper 6, multiple personnel moving along the ridgeline, approximately 400 meters from your position. She counted at least 8 figures moving with tactical precision between cover positions, clearly attempting to establish a new firing position that would give them clear shots at the trapped Americans. Stand by for second attack run. But as she banked left to line up her next firing pass, Kestrel spotted something that made her blood run cold. More movement, this time from the eastern approach. A larger group of Taliban fighters moving rapidly toward the valley, clearly intent on reinforcing their comrades and completing the encirclement of the SEAL team. The mathematics of the situation were becoming increasingly stark. 40 enemy fighters were about to become 60, and the Americans' ammunition situation was already critical. Reaper 6, be advised you have additional hostiles approaching from the east, approximately 20 personnel. They'll be in effective firing position in less than 5 minutes. The silence that followed her transmission lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When Reaper 6 responded, his voice carried the weight of a man calculating odds that weren't in his favor. Copy, Wraith. We're going to need some help with that eastern group. Our ammunition is critically low, maybe 3 magazines per man. Kestrel was already adjusting her attack plan, mind racing through the possibilities. 2 separate target areas, both requiring precision strikes to avoid friendly fire, complicated by weather conditions that were actually getting worse as the storm front moved through. The wind was gusting up to 40 knots now, making stable firing platforms nearly impossible to maintain. Affirm, Reaper 6. I'm going to work the eastern group first, then swing back for the ridge. Keep your heads down and mark your perimeter with whatever you've got, strobes, smoke, anything that helps me identify your position. As she rolled into her attack run, Captain Kestrel Thorne felt the familiar calm that always descended when the situation became truly desperate. This was where her reputation for precision and patience became not just professional assets, but matters of life and death. Every pilot in the squadron could deliver ordnance. What separated the good ones from the great ones was the ability to do it when everything was on the line, and there was no room for mistakes. The eastern group of Taliban fighters was moving in tactical bounds, using natural cover with the skill of experienced mountain fighters who understood their terrain advantages. But they hadn't counted on encountering a pilot who'd spent years perfecting the art of close air support in impossible conditions. Kestrel's targeting system locked onto the leading element of the enemy formation, and she squeezed the trigger for a controlled burst from the GAU-8. The results were immediate and devastating. The disciplined advance dissolved into chaos as depleted uranium rounds found their targets with lethal precision. Beautiful work, Wraith, Reaper 6 transmitted, and for the first time since the engagement began, there was something approaching optimism in his voice. Eastern threat is neutralized, but we still have that ridge problem and Dawn's coming fast. Captain Kestrel Thorne's A-10 climbed through the turbulent air, ice crystals forming and breaking away from her wing surfaces as she gained altitude for her third attack run of the morning. Below, the tactical situation remained precarious despite her successful strikes. The Taliban fighters on the western ridge had learned from watching their comrades get destroyed, and were now using the terrain more effectively, moving only when cloud cover provided concealment from her aircraft. Wraith, this is Overlord. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez's voice cut through the tactical frequency with an edge of concern. Be advised, fuel state and weather conditions. Storm system is intensifying and we're showing you at 50% fuel remaining. Kestrel glanced at her fuel gauge, confirming what she already knew from constant monitoring throughout the engagement. Combat flying, especially the kind of violent maneuvering required for close air support in mountainous terrain, consumed fuel at rates that peacetime training never quite prepared you for. She had perhaps 20 minutes of station time remaining before she'd need to head back to Bagram, and that was cutting it close given the deteriorating weather conditions. Copy, Overlord. Understand the time constraints. Her voice remained calm and professional, but internally she was calculating probabilities with the cold precision of someone whose entire career had been built on making impossible shots in impossible conditions. Reaper 6, I need to make this next pass count. Give me the most dangerous threat on that ridge. The response came immediately. Wraith, We've got what looks like an RPG team setting up approximately 350 meters northwest of our position, behind that large boulder formation. They're trying to get an angle on us, and if they succeed, we're in serious trouble. An RPG team changes everything. The rocket-propelled grenades were devastating against personnel in the open, and the SEAL team's position offered limited protection against high-explosive rounds fired from elevated positions. Moreover, RPG teams were typically protected by riflemen, meaning any attack on the launcher crew would immediately draw fire from supporting positions. Kestrel studied the target area through her targeting system, noting the way the Taliban fighters were using natural rock formations to mask their movements. It was a tactically sound approach that demonstrated professional military training. These weren't random insurgents but experienced fighters who understood mountain warfare and the capabilities of American close air support aircraft. I see the position, Reaper 6. This one's going to be tricky, they're well protected, and I'll need to come in at a steep angle to avoid the ridge line. She was already calculating the approach, factoring in wind conditions, terrain masking, and the need to minimize her exposure to ground fire while maintaining accuracy sufficient for a danger-close engagement. The storm continued to intensify around her aircraft, turbulence making precise flying increasingly difficult. But Captain Kestrel Thorne had built her reputation on making difficult shots in adverse conditions, and she'd never had stakes higher than 8 American lives trapped in terrain that offered no easy escape routes. Reaper 6, all personnel take hard cover. I'm coming in from the northwest, steep dive angle. Mark your position with infrared strobes if you have them. Strobes activated, Wraith. We're buttoned up and ready. Kestrel rolled her A-10 into the attack dive, the aircraft's titanium armor plating groaning under the stress of high G, maneuvering in unstable air. Through her heads-up display, she could see the target area resolving with deadly clarity. The RPG team was exactly where Reaper 6 had described, partially concealed behind natural rock cover, but exposed enough for a precision strike. Her finger found the trigger for the GAU-8 cannon. In the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez watched her approach angle on the tracking display and held his breath. The Wraith was about to prove, once again, why precision mattered more than bravado in the deadly mathematics of close air support. The cannon spoke again, and the mountain echo seemed to shake the very foundations of the Hindu Kush. The depleted uranium rounds from Captain Kestrel Thorne's GAU-8 cannon struck the RPG position with devastating precision, the high-explosive incendiary effects turning the Taliban team's cover into a deadly shower of rock fragments and shrapnel. Through her canopy, she could see secondary explosions as the RPG rounds detonated, confirming the complete destruction of what had been the most dangerous threat to the trapped SEAL team. Outstanding shot, Wraith. Reaper 6's transmission carried genuine admiration now, the voice of a ground commander who understood exactly how difficult it was to place ordnance that accurately in such conditions. RPG threat eliminated. Ridge is clear of immediate hostile activity. But even as Kestrel pulled out of her attack dive, she could see new problems developing. The storm front was intensifying rapidly, reducing visibility to near zero even at her current altitude of 10,000 feet. More concerning was her fuel state. Combat flying in turbulent conditions had consumed more fuel than her initial calculations, and she was now approaching the point where she'd need to head back to Bagram or risk not having enough fuel for a safe landing. Wraith, this is Overlord. Fuel check and weather assessment requested. Rodriguez's voice carried the tension of a commander who understood the tactical realities playing out in the mountains. If Kestrel had to leave station now, the SEALs would be on their own until another aircraft could be scrambled and reach their position, a process that would take at least 45 minutes under current conditions. Overlord showing 38% fuel remaining. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Visibility dropping to minimums and turbulence is severe. Kestrel's response was characteristically precise, but she was already thinking ahead to the next phase of the problem. Reaper 6, what's your status on ammunition and casualties? The pause before the response told her everything she needed to know. When it came, Reaper 6's voice was carefully controlled but couldn't hide the underlying strain. Wraith, we're down to emergency ammunition reserves, less than 2 magazines per man. We have 2 urgent surgical cases who need immediate evacuation, and the weather is making movement extremely difficult. The tactical picture was becoming increasingly clear, and none of it was good. The SEAL team was effectively trapped by weather, terrain, and their casualties, while her aircraft was approaching fuel states that would force her to leave them vulnerable. In the Hindu Kush Mountains, 45 minutes without air support could easily become a lifetime for soldiers surrounded by hostile forces who knew the terrain better than anyone. But Captain Kestrel Thorne had spent her entire military career in situations where conventional wisdom said success was impossible. As she circled the valley at altitude, mind racing through possibilities and probabilities, she was already formulating a plan that would push both her aircraft and her skills to their absolute limits. Overlord, Wraith requests permission to extend station time to support ground element extraction. Her transmission was calm and professional, but anyone who knew her would have recognized the subtle steel in her voice, the tone that meant she'd identified a solution that others might consider impossible. Wraith, negative on extension. Fuel state and weather conditions require immediate return to base. Rodriguez's response was immediate and by the book, the kind of decision that prioritized aircraft preservation over tactical risk-taking. Overlord respectfully request reconsideration. Ground element cannot move casualties in current conditions, and hostile forces are regrouping for another assault. Without air support, we're looking at potential loss of entire SEAL team. The silence that followed stretched across the tactical frequency like a physical thing. In the operations center at Bagram, Rodriguez was calculating risks and probabilities, weighing the life of one pilot against the lives of 8 SEALs, while considering the broader implications of losing both an experienced pilot and a valuable aircraft to weather and fuel starvation. Finally, his voice came back, heavy with the weight of command decisions that had no good options. Wraith, you are authorized to extend station time at pilot's discretion. Be advised this is outside normal parameters. You're on your own out there. Captain Kestrel Thorne allowed herself a tight smile as she acknowledged the transmission. She'd just been given permission to attempt something that aviation safety manuals would classify as extremely dangerous and tactically questionable. But 8 American lives were depending on her ability to turn impossible odds into achievable objectives. The storm continued to rage around her aircraft, but the Wraith was exactly where she belonged, between danger and the people counting on her to bring them home alive. At 18% fuel and flying in weather conditions that grounded most aircraft, Captain Kestrel Thorne made a decision that would define not just her career but her legacy. Instead of climbing to a safe altitude and heading back to Bagram, she descended into the storm, dropping to just 3,000 feet above the valley floor where 8 SEALs were fighting for their lives. The turbulence at that altitude was violent enough to stress the airframe, but it also put her below most of the cloud layer, giving her visual contact with the ground for the first time in 20 minutes. Reaper 6, Wraith is going to maintain station until you can extract your casualties. What do you need for movement to a safer position? Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had just committed to staying in the fight regardless of personal risk, and that calm certainty seemed to transmit itself through the radio waves. The response came with barely controlled relief. Wraith, we need overwatch while we move approximately 800 meters southeast to a landing zone that can accommodate a medical evacuation helicopter. We'll be exposed during movement, and hostile forces are definitely still in the area. 800 meters of exposed movement while carrying two wounded teammates in deteriorating weather, with enemy forces occupying elevated positions throughout the valley. The tactical mathematics were stark, but Captain Kestrel Thorne had spent her career making impossible mathematics work out in favor of American servicemen. She began a slow orbit of the valley, eyes constantly scanning for any sign of hostile movement while monitoring her fuel gauge with increasing concern. Copy Reaper 6, beginning overwatch now. You are cleared to move when ready. As the SEAL team began their movement, Kestrel could see them through brief breaks in the storm, 8 figures moving with tactical precision across terrain that offered minimal cover, 2 of them clearly struggling with wounded teammates who couldn't move under their own power. The discipline and professionalism were evident even from 3,000 feet. These were elite soldiers executing a dangerous extraction under impossible conditions. Then she saw the muzzle flashes. Taliban fighters had repositioned during the storm, establishing new firing positions along the southeastern ridge that commanded the route to the extraction point. The distinctive sound of AK-47 fire echoed up through the valley, followed immediately by the heavier signature of a PKM machine gun. The SEAL team was taking effective fire from at least 2 positions, pinned down in the open with limited cover and wounded personnel who couldn't move quickly. Reaper 6 taking fire from your 2 o'clock, approximately 400 meters. I have visual on hostile positions. Confirmed, Wraith. We're pinned down and can't move with casualties exposed. Need immediate suppression. Kestrel was already rolling into her attack run before the transmission ended, but her fuel gauge showed 14%, dangerously low for combat maneuvering in mountainous terrain with weather conditions that would make emergency landings essentially impossible. Every burst from the GAU-8 cannon, every violent maneuver to avoid ground fire, every second spent in combat configuration was consuming fuel at rates that pushed her closer to the point of no return. But as she lined up her targeting reticle on the hostile positions, Captain Kestrel Thorne wasn't thinking about fuel calculations or safety margins. She was thinking about 8 men who had trusted her to keep them alive long enough to complete their mission and get home to their families. The cannon fired again, depleted uranium rounds walking across the ridge line with surgical precision. The hostile fire ceased immediately, but Kestrel knew it was temporary. There were still enemy forces in the area, and they would reposition and engage again as soon as her aircraft passed out of immediate threat range. Good hits, Wraith. Hostile fire has ceased. We're moving now. As she climbed back to altitude, fuel gauge showing 12%, Captain Kestrel Thorne continued her orbit of the valley. The storm was beginning to clear slightly, revealing the full scope of the tactical situation. The SEAL team was making progress toward the extraction point, but they were moving slowly due to their casualties, and she could see additional hostile forces repositioning throughout the valley. Her fuel state meant she had perhaps 10 more minutes before she absolutely had to head back to Bagram. 10 minutes to keep 8 Americans alive in terrain that had been claiming soldiers for thousands of years. The tactical frequency crackled with a new transmission that made Captain Kestrel Thorne's blood run cold. Wraith, this is Dustoff 7-2, inbound for medical evacuation. ETA to your position 15 minutes, but we're showing heavy weather and need you to maintain air superiority until we can get our patients out of there. 15 minutes. With 12% fuel remaining and weather conditions that were marginal for helicopter operations, 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours. But the arrival of the medical evacuation helicopter changed the tactical equation dramatically. Now it wasn't just about keeping 8 SEALs alive until they could reach safety. It was about protecting a slow-moving, unarmed aircraft during the most vulnerable phase of a combat rescue operation. Copy, Dustoff 7-2. Be advised whether conditions are severe and hostile forces remain active throughout the area. Recommend you approach from the southeast and maintain maximum altitude until final approach. Kestrel's response was professionally calm, but she was already calculating fuel consumption rates and trying to determine exactly how long she could maintain station. Reaper 6, what's your status on movement to the extraction point? The response came between bursts of automatic weapons fire. Wraith, we're approximately 400 meters from the LZ, but taking intermittent contact from multiple positions. These guys aren't giving up. They know we're trying to extract, and they're repositioning to interdict. Kestrel could see the problem developing with crystal clarity. The Taliban fighters weren't just randomly engaging the SEAL team. They were conducting a coordinated effort to prevent the extraction, moving to establish interlocking fields of fire that would make helicopter operations impossible. It was tactically sound and professionally executed, the work of experienced fighters who understood mountain warfare and the vulnerabilities of American rescue operations. Her fuel gauge now showed 10%, well below the minimum required for safe return to Bagram under normal conditions. In current weather, with the headwinds and turbulence she'd faced during the flight back, 10% fuel was essentially empty. But the medical evacuation helicopter was still 10 minutes out, and the SEAL team needed continuous air support to have any chance of reaching the extraction point alive. Captain Kestrel Thorne made her choice with the same calm precision that had characterized every decision of her military career. She keyed her radio and transmitted on the tactical frequency, her voice carrying absolute conviction, despite the mathematical impossibility of what she was proposing. All stations, Wraith is extending station time for dust-off operations. Will maintain overwatch until all personnel are extracted. In the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez stared at his fuel calculations and realized what she just committed to do. At current consumption rates, she would run out of fuel before she could return to base. She was betting her life that she could keep 8 SEALs and a helicopter crew alive long enough to complete the mission, even if it meant going down in the Hindu Kuh.